Thank you so much. Thank you. Appreciate it. Appreciate it. Well, can y'all hear me? Can y'all see me? It, it is a real pleasure to be here with you all, and it's great to see so many friends and familiar faces. I hope that you will enjoy the next 45 minutes to an hour. I do have a pretty in-depth program to share with you all, so I want to get right into it. But let me just say quickly, before I dive in here, last month I actually began working, running the little Gloucester Museum of History. So in addition to being a Fort Monroe guy and living there, I'm now doing the drive through Yorktown and across the Coleman Bridge every day to work at the Gloucester Museum of History right in Gloucester Courthouse. So I offered Bob, I said, if you need someone to talk about Gloucester Museum in a year or two, I'm happy to do that. But I am continuing to do a lot of work and research related to Fort Monroe because it is a place that I'm very passionate about and live at and enjoy. And it's a wonderful, wonderful place with a lot of very complex history, a lot of really interesting stories. This program really came out of a research project that I began really over about 2.5 to 3 years ago, focused on looking at archival records at the National Archives in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And I'll go through all that in the program. But when I began doing this work, and based on the findings, I came home and I said, man, this is really, really important stuff. And we need to figure out a way to document this. It's one thing to go out and talk to the community and share with folks like you all about this. But it's also important, this is a national monument. And it's important to make sure that this history and these stories reach a broader audience. So at the advice of my father, who's a retired PhD chemist, he said, Kelly, actually he said Robert, he doesn't call my last name. That was my other boss. He said, I'm just so excited to be here. He said, Robert, son, you need to publish. If you publish, they can never take it away from you, and you'll get the word out there. He said, you need to publish your findings. I said, yes, Father, I will publish my findings. Just like that. And this is a guy that has 100 publications, scientific journals and all this stuff. And so, when he told me, I said, yeah, right, this will be easy, So I decided to kind of, write this up. And I contacted a journal hosted by Yale University, the Journal of Contemporary Archival Studies, presented them a abstract and a draft, and lo and behold, they said, we'd love to publish this. You got a lot more work to do on it, but we'd love for you to publish it. So if you Google the Journal of Contemporary Archival Studies, you can actually find, it's only 10 pages, which is nice. I wanted to do something kind of short, but it is published, and it was published in May. So I decided that it'd be really cool to put together a little PowerPoint program where I actually have photographs and images to kind of make a paper a little more exciting. So that's kind of what I'm going to share with you all today. The paper is called Humanizing the Enslaved at Fort Monroe's Arc of Freedom, and that's what I've entitled my program. So let's dig right into this. It's probably going to be about a 45 to 50-minute program, and I welcome Q&A at the end. I've got nowhere to be this afternoon, so I can hang out as long as y'all want me to and talk about Fort Monroe and Gloucester and boating and whatever else y'all are interested in. In 1619, 200 years before the construction of Fort Monroe, the first Africans brought to the English North American colonies arrived on a ship as captives along the shores of Point Comfort. This singular event represents the beginning of slavery in the future United States of America. In 1861, amid the onset of the American Civil War, slavery began to unravel on the very same peninsula. 3 enslaved men, Frank Baker, James Townsend, and Shepard Mallory, escaped the Confederate Army in Norfolk, Virginia, and bravely voyaged across the waterway to the Union stronghold of Fort Monroe. Not returned to slavery, but instead classified as contraband of war by Major General Benjamin Franklin Butler, the men's courage inspired a crusade. By 1865, well over 10,000 formerly enslaved men, women, and children sought refuge at the fort. As a result of Butler's contraband decision and the brave action of those early men and women, the fort earned the nickname Freedom's Fortress. Inspired by these events, President Barack Obama proclaimed Fort Monroe a national monument on November 1, 2011. 9 years ago, almost. It seems like it was just yesterday. President Obama concluded that the site of Fort Monroe, quote, marks both the beginning and end of slavery in our nation. Reflecting on this powerful statement, the complex history of the site can succinctly be expressed as the Fort Monroe Ark of Freedom. While 1619 and 1861 denote the beginning and the beginning of the end of slavery in America, there is a lesser-known story that involves the enslaved who helped build Freedom's Fortress. Enslaved people performed a paradoxical role. They helped to labor and erect a fort designed to defend American freedom. And just think about that for a minute. Enslaved people are designing a fort to defend American freedom. Now, we don't have many images of the fort's construction. We have drawings and maps and plans and all these things. And of course, this is going on in the 1820s, so we don't have photographs. Boy, I'd love to see some photographs. If we could have photographs of the construction, wouldn't that be cool? But we don't. We have some drawings, but I really wanted to find some kind of image that would represent what this may have looked like. And this, obviously, this image comes from South Africa. But I really thought it was very engaging because it is of the same time period. It is enslaved people building a structure. And notice how the people are depicted. They're just shadows. They're just shadows. And I think this is a great way to think about how enslaved people of this time period were viewed as shadows. They're there, but they're really not to be seen or heard. Yet they're doing this work. So again, that's why I really like this image. This is from South Africa of 1800 called Mode of Building with Clay and Water. Now, during the Civil War, the irony of slaves constructing large portions of Fort Monroe came full circle when the fort became a refuge and gateway for African Americans, as we talked about briefly with the contraband decision. This is a iconic image, and we will revisit this story a little bit later. Now, in order to develop new perspectives on the fort's role in slavery and emancipation, I began investigating primary source documents related to Fort Monroe in the Ark of Freedom. I traveled to the National Archives and Records Administration in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, with the hope of discovering documents that may humanize the enslaved. And what I mean by humanize is began to give story or identity to slaves. How can we do that? And going through records was one start. Many of you are familiar with the archives. Yes, the National Archives in Washington, D.C., where the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence is on display. But there are other National Archives sites around the country. All of the Fort Monroe-related collection for engineering is in Philadelphia. It is literally in a great big warehouse building with a teeny tiny reading room. But it's a wonderful place for a historian or a geek like me. Record Group 77. The archives classify things by record group. Record Group 77 is the records of the Office of the Chief of Engineers. This was the logical collection to examine, knowing that the United States Army Corps of Engineers supervised all construction at the fort. This beautiful 1818 drawing before you is one of the earliest renderings of what would become Fort Monroe. And this is an example of one of those things that was discovered in the archives. This is a color document. It's about yay big. I could sit and look at this thing for hours. It's beautiful. And again, you notice the moat all around the fort. It's just a really neat image. Encompassing the years 1815 to 1917, so about 102 years, this collection, this Record Group 77 collection, holds meticulous records documenting everything from orders of stone and brick to the daily accounting of labor. For this project, the following entries were examined: records of work done by slave labor at Fort Monroe, letters sent to the Chief of Engineers from Fort Monroe. So these are letters sent to Washington, D.C. from Fort Monroe, reporting the status of the construction. Press copies, so these are copies of reports of operations at Forts Calhoun, Wool, and Monroe. Listings of civilians employed at Fort Monroe. Civilians, they employed civilians as well, just like we think about now. There's contracted employees. and time books and payrolls relating to Forts Monroe, Calhoun, and Wool. And again, we will revisit this as we travel along this program. The image before you is representational of the Record Group 77 finding aid. Again, I reiterate, the Fort Monroe portion of Record Group 77 is immense, over 50 entries and hundreds of volumes. It's a severely underutilized collection, and according to the archivist that I was working with there, researchers had not really accessed much of this collection in the last 20 years. So again, it was really kind of exciting to be going through records that have not been accessed in many years. And again, from the screen in front of you, you can see how they're organized. Entry 1103, Register of Work Done by Slave Labor. Those are the dates. There's 2 volumes. The finding aid gives you a little bit of information. Entry 1066, these are letters sent by the engineer office at Fort Monroe. So again, these are the engineers that are on the ground reporting back to Washington, D.C. what's going on. So there's a lot of detail in these documents. So today I will share preliminary results from some of this research. Section 1 of the program will focus on the slaves who worked at Fort Monroe during its early construction. Documentation was found showing the first and last names of enslaved people, names of slave owners, their rates of compensation, and the specific tasks that slaves completed. Section 2 of today's program will focus on the Civil War era and the formerly enslaved known as contrabands who worked at the fort. Research revealed the first and last names of contraband laborers, their rates of pay, and types of labor they performed. Also, records were discovered offering clues about one of the first slaves declared as contraband at the fort. That's a little teaser to keep you all awake. Section 3 will outline future initiatives intended to improve access to archival records pertaining to the enslaved and contraband laborers. Once this project is completed, whenever that is, when I have more time and research and resources. Once completed, it will expand our understanding of this Fort Monroe Arc of Freedom, simultaneously inspiring additional research and fresh perspectives about slavery, agency, and emancipation. So let's dig right into this. And this is somewhat of I use this as a header for one of my sections in my paper. And a couple of my reviewers said, this is very strong. And I said, that's exactly right. That's what I want it to be. Black laborers are the only ones serviceable in this climate. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Gratiot, he's the supervising engineer, and he's reporting to Washington, D.C. And this is one of the things he actually said in a letter in November 7th of 1820. Designed by French engineer Simon Bernard in 1818 and operational by 1834, Fort Monroe was intended to protect the Chesapeake Bay and the Hampton Roads Harbor. Bernard's plan called for a massive 6-sided fort with impregnable masonry walls surrounded by an 8-foot deep wet ditch or moat. According to one engineer drawing, the 63-acre fort, and we're talking about 63 acres, that's just the area within the side of the moat. The 63-acre fort had the capacity of mounting 412 various pieces of ordnance. The construction of Fort Monroe was an immense undertaking requiring large quantities of skilled craftsmen and general laborers. This 1818 drawing you see in front of you is one of the earliest surveys. Again, this is a National Archives find, about this big, full color. It's beautiful. You could just look at them over and over again. The portrait of Simon Bernard was actually provided to me by one of his descendants in France. They have a full size hanging over their fireplace in their flat in Paris, which they sent me a picture of. And this is, again, a beautiful image. If you notice to the right of Bernard, you may not be able to see it, but there's a drawing sitting there, and that is a drawing of a fortification. Bernard was a master designer of fortifications, was Napoleon's aide-de-camp at one point. Fascinating guy, and that's a whole other story. So the United States brings over a Frenchman to design our forts. That's another lecture, but he is a hero of mine. Now, newspaper advertisements seeking hundreds of laborers for the project were published throughout Virginia in early 1819. They're going to start this project. They need labor. Both male and female slave owners living throughout the region recognized an opportunity for economic profit and began leasing their slaves to the United States Army. So let's think about this, leasing their property to the United States Army for a profit. As a result, the engineers maintained registers to record the hours and days slaves worked in order to compensate who? The slave owners. So the Army was registering, they were calculating the number of days, hours, and who was doing this work so that slave owners, not the enslaved people, but slave owners would be paid. Housed within Record Group 77 is an extraordinary example of one of these registers, the register of work done by slave labor at Fort Monroe. Encompassing the years 1820 to 1824 and amassed in 2 giant volumes, this 300-page register, which you see one page of in front of you, is particularly significant because it denotes both first and last names of enslaved people almost 50 years before African Americans are recorded in a United States census. This is a big deal. Folks, families who are trying to do genealogy, it's hard to find first and last names of your family before 1870 because they're not in a census. So again, if you know that you had family living in and around Fort Monroe, if you're African American, this type of documentation can be very, very significant to helping you find your ancestors. Now, additional information in adjacent columns, I realize it's hard to see, and again, I'll tell you a little bit about this document, obviously. But additional information in adjacent columns includes the names of slave owners, the number of days slaves worked each month, rates of pay, and a final column on the far right for remarks. While not often populated, the remarks column occasionally includes words such as absent, sick, discharged, deserted, or died. And again, that's a picture of my bald head there in the reading room, just to prove that I was there doing the work. And I love showing this to students because, yeah, historians still use magnifying glasses and, you know, it's tedious stuff. The register's fragile and faded pages included name after name of enslaved people. John Ingram, Phil Martin, Robert Mosley, Amos Smith, Daniel Williamson, George Whitehead. After photographing both volumes, because that's how we can capture these things as archivists and historians, is we have to photograph them. That's what I'm doing there. As you can see, that's actually a light stand and there's a camera. So we're photographing each page so we can take it, so you can take it home and actually look at it and use it. After photographing both volumes, an initial examination has already revealed about 300 slaves belonging to more than 50 different slave owners. Many of the slave owners listed have names that remain very common in Tidewater, Virginia, including William Armistead. We've all heard the name Armistead if we're from Virginia. John Day, Thomas Herbert, Sarah Ingram, Martha King, Samuel Watts Jr. Some of these names are recognized near Fort Monroe today. There's roads named after some of these folks and their families. There's neighborhoods. It's also important to recognize that this isn't just white men doing this leasing of slaves to the Army. We have several women, Sarah Ingram, Martha King, who are renting their slaves to the United States Army. So there's often this, we often stop and forget that women were part of this as well. The entry 1103 register, this register, also provided insight regarding the economic motivation for slave owners to lease their slaves to the United States Army. With slaves earning their owners an average of 38 cents per day, an owner received approximately $9 per month for each slave they had working at the fort. A majority of the slave owners listed had fewer than 5 slaves working per month. However, there are recorded instances of some owners sending dozens of their slaves to work for the Army. In January 1822, for example, it is recorded that John Tabb Smith had 25 of his slaves employed at the fort. During that month, Smith's slaves earned him $200.24. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Price Index, $200 in 1822 is equivalent to the purchasing power of about $4,300 in today's money. This represents significant income and demonstrates the interdependence that developed between slave owners and the United States Army at Fort Monroe. In addition to this register, Record Group 77 contains multi-volume record books that incorporate letters, drawings, reports, and orders issued by the Army engineers. Oversized and leather-bound, the record books document many aspects of the fort's construction, including details about specific tasks laborers were expected to complete. Laborers hauled bricks and stones and operated rope and pulley cranes to move building materials around the site. There is also evidence that enslaved people engaged in highly skilled tasks as well, such as roofing, plastering, masonry work, carpentry, cutting stone, and serving as boatmen or crews on boats. The best documented evidence of skilled labor at the fort involves brick making and masonry work. In the summer of 1818, the engineers contracted a Mr. Beletha Laws to provide masonry services. We're going to come back to Mr. Laws here in a minute. But I want to flash an image here on the screen. This is from Boone Hall Plantation in Charleston. And these are fingerprints that are found on bricks. These are fingerprints of the enslaved who are actually making these bricks. So once again, we have just this striking paradox, if you will, of this beautiful plantation home with the fingerprints of an enslaved person on them. I also visited Fort Pulaski. Again, it was mentioned in my introduction that I love forts, so I'm always looking around at different forts. I visited Fort Pulaski down in Savannah last year, and the park ranger there, who's a good friend of mine, took me into this, one of the casemates there, one of the areas where they had, where they would have mounted guns, and he shined his flashlight in the wall, and he said, "Do you see it?" And I said, "What are you talking about, Joel? What are you talking about, man? Do you see it?" And I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And we moved a little bit closer, and what he was showing me is where they had discovered some fingerprints on some bricks that had been, again, made by enslaved laborers. So again, this is just another one of those kind of little clues that's right there if you look, that sometimes you'll find. We have not, I haven't found any of these at Fort Monroe, but I guarantee they've got to be there somewhere. And when you visit Fort Monroe the next time, look at the bricks. And if anyone asks you a question, say you're looking for fingerprints. And it's not, it's, I don't mean to make light of it because people might look at you kind of funny, but in all seriousness, it's one of those kind of, it takes you back. And because again, in Fort Pulaski, I put my fingers in those fingerprints, and you kind of shut your eyes, and even as someone who's white, pretty dang white, I can still, you feel it. You feel that there's something there, and it's moving, and it really connects you to this history and to this story. So again, all jokes aside, yes, sir.
Now, when you identify, do you think those fingerprints were intentional from the slave father?
I doubt that. Just of the byproduct of because when you're moving these bricks, when they're newly made, before you fire them, they're soft clay. So, and again, one thing we learned in the Fort Monroe work is the masons they took great pride in their work. So again, the masons probably would not want any blemishes at all on their bricks. And again, that's why this brick is actually inside somewhere. It's not, outside. It's kind of inside the fort, or not this brick, but the brick I was describing from Fort Pulaski was actually inside of a space that, again, you had to use a flashlight and you kind of had to look a little bit up, so. Yes, sir?
That's typical. They use a heck of a lot of water.
Yep. And again, this is Charleston. They do things funny down there anyway. Now, so back to Beletha Laws, and I know this is a little bit small. Census data from 1820 shows that Laws was responsible for an entourage of 79 people, including 29 slaves. A May 10, 1820 report in the archives included the names of 16 people notated as black laborers belonging to Beletha Laws. Now, this is where it got really, really exciting and really personal, because we were able to take this census record, which is very impersonal. It has Beletha Laws' name on the far left, and if you see, it says free white across the top, slaves in free colored. It's just numbers. There's no names, okay? So we were able to take, I was able to look at this census, and then with the archival records, begin to actually learn the identity of some of the enslaved people. So we saw in this May 10th, 1820 report, Black laborers belonging to beneath the law. Some of those names included Joseph Reed, Emmanuel Bancroft, Moses Williams, Ned Jennings, and Barnaby Armstead. So now we can begin to actually assign names to these numbers. And for me, and for anybody who's interested in the fort's history, that is really, really, really cool. Now, additional contemporaneous engineer records in the archives confirms that these men, these enslaved men belonging to laws, were manufacturing 800,000 bricks per month, erecting casemates and building structures within and around the fort. The enslaved, serving as brick makers and masons, exemplified one of the most significant ironies of this Fort Monroe Ark of Freedom. Slave labor physically built considerable portions of Freedom's fortress, brick by brick. Also included in entry 1066 are details about the daily work schedule. I often get this question: what was the day like for someone working at the fort? On April 1, 1820, Army engineer Captain Frederick Lewis issued orders that, quote, listen closely, quote, the work bell will be rung at daybreak, the breakfast at 7 o'clock, the dinner bell at 1 o'clock, an hour will be allowed for each meal. At sunset, labor will cease, supper will be served immediately thereafter, and at 9, the retreat bell will notify all to retire to rest. Long day. While much construction progress had been made by 1824, the work schedule remained just as rigorous. On July 30th, 1824, Superintending Engineer Charles Gratiot recorded that the workdays at Fort Monroe would begin 15 minutes before sunrise and conclude 15 minutes after its setting. There were small increments of time built in for meals and breaks, but during those long summer months, those long days in July and August, the workday approached 15 hours. Now, this is not an image of Fort Monroe. This is an image from Fort Hancock, New Jersey. And I really, really liked it because, well, I'll tell you why. Due to the strenuous tasks and long days, illness and severe injuries were common among laborers during the construction era. In this circa 1885 image from Fort Hancock, New Jersey, you can see large-scale construction, the large-scale construction operation that fort building is. Notice the rope and pulley systems. Those are those long poles. And if you notice at the very top of those poles, there are ropes and pulleys for moving large stones. These stones weigh 10, 20, 30 tons. Huge stones, granite, solid granite. This looks like a very complicated and a very dangerous environment. As you can imagine, crushed appendages, head injuries, flesh wounds were frequent as laborers hauled, hoisted, cut, and installed massive stones, bricks, and timbers. There is also evidence that laborers were killed while in service to the engineers. The story of Amos Henley epitomizes the dangers experienced by laborers working at the fort. Identified as an enslaved laborer and member of a barge crew, Amos Henley first appeared in the engineers' records on May 10, 1820. He was owned by William Henley of Norfolk, Virginia, and he's later recorded within the register of work done by slave laborers. So we have him pinpoint twice in the archival records. And he first appears in the record as working, he first appears in the register of work done by slave labor in February of 1821. During the month of February, Amos worked 16½ days. It is recorded that he worked 27 days in March, 14 days in April, and 27 in May. This is all 1821. His service as an enslaved laborer continued through the summer until tragedy struck. In September of 1821, the register, which is on your left at the very bottom, you can't really see it, but in entry 64, it says that Amos Henley was killed the 19th instant by windlass crank. We don't really know what that meant at first. We do know what a windlass crank is, and we see a couple images. I was really trying to find some images of enslaved people using them, and I couldn't find it. But basically, a windlass, much like on a ship, it's part of a rope and pulley system designed to raise stone. There's a lot of tension, and there's a lot of ways you could get hurt using one of these things. And again, imagine lifting stones that are this big. It's crazy. It's crazy. Now, it's amazing. So we've discovered that this gentleman's killed, and then I began to do a little bit of just because this is what historians do, began to do a little bit of digging and Googling and newspapering and all this stuff. And lo and behold, the American Beacon and Norfolk and Portsmouth Daily Advertiser newspaper actually captured the essence of the Amos Henley tragedy on September 20th, 1821. This was shocking to find. And I'll read this to you. Quote, "We regret to state that a Negro lad named Amos, about 23 years of age, the property of William D. Henley, Esquire of this town, Norfolk, was killed at Old Point Comfort," that's Fort Monroe, "yesterday about noon by a blow on the head from the windlass crank while engaged with several others in raising heavy stone. His body was brought up to town last evening in the steamboat Hampton and interred." The Amos Henley story is a sobering reminder of the hardships that all laborers faced while building this fort. Henley's death evokes great sorrow, yet decades later his story inspires research with the hope of humanizing many more of the enslaved who labored at the fort. Henley's contributions, like all of those laborers from the fort's construction era, paved the way for future generations of enslaved people to experience Fort Monroe not as a labor camp, but as freedom's fortress. Now, part two, Fort Monroe becomes freedom's fortress. And this is another one of those great images that appeared in the newspaper. We're fast forwarding now to the Civil War era, but this is another one of those images. And if you look in the very back, on the back right, you see a great big American flag, and that's Fort Monroe. So again, this is a very common image from the early days, well, really throughout the Civil War, of families coming to Fort Monroe for refuge, for safety, for a better opportunity, to get away from slavery, to get food. By 1834, the main portions of Fort Monroe were completed. However, the engineers' work was not finished as repairs and alterations continued throughout the mid-19th century. This isn't a 10-year building project. This is a multi-decadal issue. As 1860 approached and conflict became increasingly likely, the Army focused on preparing Fort Monroe for war. During the winter and early spring of 1861, the fort was resupplied and the Army had mounted additional cannon. On April 30th, 1861, the commanding general of the United States Army, Brevet Lieutenant General Winfield Scott, noted, quote, "Fort Monroe is by far the most secure post now in the possession of the U.S." The Army engineers continued wartime preparations as Virginia inched towards secession, ultimately separating from the Union on May 23rd, 1861. For slaves and slave owners living near Fort Monroe, life changed the very next day. On May 24th, 1861, Union Commander Major General Benjamin Butler refused to return 3 fugitive slaves to their owner, instead declaring them as contraband of war. Within days, word spread, and hundreds of slaves began appearing at the Union stronghold. On June 8th, 1861, just 15 days after Butler's contraband decision, Frank Leslie's Illustrated newspaper reported that approximately 500 contrabands were at Fort Monroe and that, quote, "General Butler had made the best possible use of an evil and employed the able-bodied to work at the entrenchments while the women have been set to washing, cleaning, etc." This statement suggests that at least some of the earliest contrabands were working for the engineers who were the ones responsible for building and maintaining the entrenchments at the fort. As the number of contraband laborers increased, the Army made efforts to actually formalize the rapidly evolving situation. General Order Number 34, issued by the commander of the Department of Virginia on November 1, 1861, specified that contrabands working for the Army at Fort Monroe were to be compensated and provided food and clothing. To ensure their accurate compensation, the engineers began keeping detailed records of hours and days contrabands worked. Again, registers, which are going to be in the archives. Therefore, the reports of operations at Forts Monroe, Calhoun, and Wool, and reports of civilians employed at Fort Monroe were the next collection I decided I need to examine. Recorded monthly, these reports document the names of engineer officers at the fort, the number of hired men, their rates of pay, their total compensation, and corresponding precisely with the issuance of General Order Number 34, the first recorded contrabands working for the United States engineers appear in their November 1861 report. During November 1861, the engineers noted that 31 of the 53 hired men at Fort Monroe were contraband laborers. Analyzing the data from November 61 to September 62 confirmed that contrabands were consistently employed at Fort Monroe as, again, hired men. Beginning in October of 62, the monthly reports incorporate less information about the labor demographic and more about the specific tasks that folks were doing. During the fall of 1862, for example, laborers worked at the fort's redoubt and were busy receiving and moving construction materials. While entry 1080 provided details about the number of laborers and their tasks, it did not include names. Entry 1105, time books and payrolls relating to Forts Monroe, Calhoun, and Wool, was then examined in hopes of finding the names of contrabands employed at the fort. This collection has 28 volumes. These 28 volumes are books about this big. That page in real life is about this wide. So you're at a big table and you're opening these things, and it's a big book, and there's lots and lots of names. The 28 volumes of this record group include time books and payrolls. Reviewing the Fort Monroe era, Civil War era collection, as you can see here, the payrolls listed the names of individuals classified as laborers employed by the engineers. While not identified specifically as contrabands, when the names were cross-referenced with pre-Civil War records, it was discovered that most, if not all, of those listed as laborers at this time period were previously enslaved people. Here's the key. Additional information that those listed were former slaves was the discovery of a very, very familiar name. Number 26 there, blown up, Washington Fields. In Come On Children, an autobiography written by one of Washington Fields' 11 children. So this is an autobiography written by one of the man that's identified there in the register. One of his 11 kids wrote this book. And his name is George Washington Fields. So Dad's name is Washington Fields, and one of his sons' name is George Washington Fields. So again, it's a little complicated. But George Washington Fields describes the cruelties of slavery that included the separation of family members. Fields also detailed the pivotal events that led to the family's flight to freedom during the Civil War. According to the autobiography, his father, Washington Fields, followed Union soldiers and arrived at Fort Monroe on June 11, 1864. The records in the archives substantiated Washington Fields' arrival at the fort and list him as a laborer. During July of 64, it is recorded that Washington Fields worked 24 10-hour days and was compensated $28.80 by the Army engineers. His name consistently appears in the records, as it is documented that he worked at the fort through July of 1866. So that's another thing to kind of keep in the back of your mind. We think of contraband as strictly a Civil War era thing, but a lot of these folks continued working after the Civil War for the Army. The entire Fields family, was eventually reunited at Fort Monroe, and their story provides important background on what many slaves experienced as they journeyed to Fort Monroe. Fascinating read. Definitely suggest reading this if you can find it. It is available online for free if you Google around a little bit. Fascinating book. Now, within the context of the harrowing and courageous stories recounted in Come On Children, in that wonderful book, discovering Washington Fields in the National Archives was a profound experience. Reflecting on his story and the story of his family within the context of this arc of freedom that we're talking about, this payroll, this document, this entry 1105, is much more than just a payroll. It is a list of freedom seekers, each with an important and inspiring story to tell. As historians, as researchers, we just have to dig and find those stories. They're there. While not originally within the scope of this project, the time books and payrolls, again the same documents, for Fort Calhoun were reviewed as well in hopes of discovering additional names of laborers. Also remaining a Union stronghold throughout the Civil War and later renamed Fort Wool, Fort Calhoun was built at the same time as Fort Monroe, intended to complement Fort Monroe in the defense of the Chesapeake Bay. Again, my little laser doesn't work, but if you see the word Fort Monroe, below it says Old Point Comfort. Directly south of that is Fort Calhoun. Fort Calhoun was renamed Fort Wool. It's the fort that's right there in the middle of the harbor when you're going across the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel where there's a flag. Fort Calhoun remained in Union control just like Fort Monroe did throughout the entire Civil War. Now, the payrolls of January of 63, and again, this is from Fort Calhoun. You can see across the top. It says Fort Calhoun. The payrolls of January 63 revealed the first and last names of 150 individuals recorded as laborers. Many surnames were familiar, including Jones, Latimer, and Selden, having previously been identified as slave or colored laborer in entry 1105. So what I quickly began to discover, and I kind of knew this in the back of my mind, but it was proven by this, is that the Army looked at Fort Monroe and Calhoun kind of as one place because they were so close to each other, and they could shuttle laborers back and forth. So that's why it became very important to look at the registers for Fort Calhoun as well, because what would often happen is if there was not any work at Fort Monroe, they had the laborers, they'd send them to Fort Calhoun and vice versa. So it was important to look at this as a complex. Think of these two forts as a complex, and that's exactly how the Army viewed it. Now, further evidence suggesting that all of these individuals on the far left were black laborers and most likely formerly enslaved was the discovery of another very familiar name, and that name is Shepherd Mallory. Long-standing oral tradition holds that Shepherd Mallory, spelled with an O, and we're going to talk about this misspelling. If you see Mallery, we're going to talk about this. But long-standing oral tradition holds that Shepherd Mallory, spelled with an O, along with Frank Baker and James Townsend, were the first three slaves declared as contraband of war at Fort Monroe by Major General Butler. While not identifying them by name, Union and Confederate Army correspondence from 1861 confirms that the three men Butler refused to return were slaves, quote, belonging to Colonel Charles K. Mallory. Is the Shepherd Mallory listed in entry 1105 before you? Is this a simple misspelling? And is the name Shepherd Mallory, is this the same person from the contraband oral tradition? The 1850, 1860, and 1870 United States Census records for Elizabeth City County, the county adjacent to Fort Monroe, were reviewed in an effort to gain clarity on this very question. The census records document at least 44 people with the surname Mallory, Mallory, and it is noteworthy that the name Mallery does not appear at all. Doesn't appear. There's no one by the last name of Mallery in Hampton. So again, and then I talked to some friends that had done some linguistic work from this time, and they said, this is just a misspelling. They sounded out things phonetically. And the other comment was that I got from several folks was, just because a Union soldier was taking down this name doesn't mean that Union soldier could read and write either. So it's phonetics. It's phonetics. So again, I have no doubt in my mind that this is the same Shepherd Mallory. Additionally, the 1870 census provided a remarkable find, the name Shepherd Mallory. Again, you can't really see it very well here, but next to the numbers 413467, you see Mallory, Shepherd, 37. Mallory is described as 37 years old, mulatto, and married to Fanny Mallory, age 27. The census shows that they had three sons, Shepherd, age 7, and again, this is in 1870. William, age 5, and Frank, who was less than a year old. Based on the census records, the Shepherd Mallory recorded in entry 1105 in the archival records is likely a misspelling and could very well be the same individual listed in the 1870 census. For over 150 years, the names Frank Baker, James Townsend, and Shepherd Mallory have only been passed down through oral tradition. If indeed a misspelling, this is the first primary source produced that confirms that someone with the name Shepherd Mallory worked for the United States Army within the environs of Fort Monroe during the Civil War. It's pretty cool. As a result of this research, we're now closer than ever to confirming the identity of one of the three original contrabands. And with further investigation, it may be possible to confirm the contraband oral history, the names. And when I say contraband oral history, I'm talking about the names. It'd be able to confirm those names in entirety, or that oral history in entirety. Now, the preliminary findings from this project confirm that enslaved people and contrabands associated with Fort Monroe could be identified and humanized through archival research. I've provided a few of those examples where we've identified them, and through secondary sources and other primary sources, we're able to actually begin to uncover a little bit about the life and times of these folks. That's very, very important. It's important to think of people as people, not as slaves. It's important to think of people that have names and that loved and who suffered and who cared about their family members. It's important to think of all people, whether they're free, enslaved, that way. So again, we began to, with this archival work, begin to actually humanize folks that for 150 years has been referred to simply as slaves. Even the language today, you hear me use the word enslaved a lot. That is part of this effort as well. These were not slaves. They were human beings that had been enslaved. Now, as a result, we've already found hundreds of names from these registers, first and last names, and we're just beginning to understand the full scope and the complexity of this Ark of Freedom. The Amos Henley story, in finding the names Washington Fields and Shepard Mallory, that's strong evidence that supports the need for additional research. In partnership with the Fort Monroe National Monument, the Casemate Museum is one of those institutions responsible for developing exhibits and programming in the Fort Monroe Visitor and Education Center. Slated to open very soon, the Visitor and Education Center is a legacy project of the Virginia 2019 commemoration and will feature exhibits pertaining to the Fort Monroe Ark of Freedom. One exhibit, which I was able to spend a considerable time working on, will actually include several pages of the register of work done by slave labor, featured in an interactive display. So you actually be able to walk up to a computer and manipulate this document and zoom in and see the names of both enslaved and slave owners. It's going to be pretty cool. Visitors will be able to view and explore this primary source using touchscreen technology and high-resolution magnification. In addition, myself and others at the museum are transcribing the list of names with the goal of creating some sort of searchable database, which will be a great research tool in the future. For African American families in particular, access to this source, which includes first and last names, may facilitate genealogical connections that were previously impossible to validate. Again, it's really important to remember that prior to 1870, it's very difficult to find first and last names of African Americans in the United States. So again, records like this provide a big opening for folks. Another goal is a continuation of research in all of these payrolls. I did not get through all the payrolls. There's 28 volumes, okay? Each volume has hundreds of pages. So the Mallory, I call it the Mallory and Mallory discoveries, are significant. Further research may clarify the spelling discrepancy and substantiate that these names correspond to the same individual. Additionally, these discoveries suggest that those who were declared as contrabands at Fort Monroe may have actually had ancestors who helped build Fort Monroe. So just think about that for a minute. As we think about the 1860s contraband decision, well, 40 years earlier, enslaved people were there building the fort. So again, if we can begin to identify first and last names of both groups of people from the 1820s and the 1860s, I feel pretty confident we will find families that were involved in both the construction of the fort and then ultimately sought refuge there. And again, let that sink in for a minute. I mean, that's really important stuff. Now, the vast number of names identified in the Fort Monroe Army Engineer records suggests that there may be additional slaves and contrabands listed elsewhere in other military records at the National Archives. Remember, enslaved people were not only used at Fort Monroe to build that fort. Any other fort that was built prior to 1860 is going to have enslaved people building it. So you can go to the archives, and there's a slew of forts. And again, this is also government projects. Who was involved in building major parts of Washington, D.C. pre-emancipation? So again, the Army and the government kept track of often first and last names, again, to be able to pay their owners. So again, I firmly believe that there's additional records in the archives that will help to tell these stories. We do know, for example, that Civil War era correspondence indicates that the Fort Monroe Quartermaster Department was responsible for issuing clothing to contrabands. Did the Quartermaster Department maintain detailed records like the Army Engineers? And if so, do they include names of contrabands under their care? Potentially. Additionally, within Record Group 105, there's a series named Census of people helped by the government at Fort Monroe, Virginia, circa 1863 to 65. Once this collection is examined, what additional clues about contrabands will be discovered? The United States National Park Service and the Fort Monroe Authority of the Commonwealth of Virginia jointly manage Fort Monroe. The fort is now open to the public. The history is interpreted at the Casemate Museum, and new exhibits in the Fort Monroe Visitor and Education Center will be unveiled later this year. It is hoped that improved access and understanding of archival records will inspire visitors to reflect on what freedom meant in 1619, 1861, and maybe most important of all, what does freedom mean today? When completed, this research project has the potential to reveal thousands of names previously lost to history, enabling us to humanize and commemorate the countless individuals associated with the Fort Monroe Ark of Freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. We have time for a few questions. What I would appreciate it if you would do is if you have a question, raise your hand and let me get you the mic, because even though we may be able to hear you in this room, we need it for the videotaping. So if you have a question, raise your hand and I'll come to you. One back here.
You're not allowed to go first.
Where is Fort Hancock in New Jersey?
Sandy Hook. Sandy Hook, yeah, right across, right kind of opposite. Well, I'll say when you're at Sandy Hook on a clear day, you can see the Statue of Liberty if you're looking, northwest.
So it's sort of across from Fort Hamilton and Brooklyn.
Yes, yeah. It's a really interesting site. It's a coast artillery site built in the 1880s, and again, it was deactivated and it got really beat up by Hurricane Sandy. So a lot of the beautiful historic buildings are in really rough shape. But it's a National Park Service site now.
Okay. And the other question, where could one get a copy of that picture of the fort?
This picture was actually taken by the National Park Service. So if you contact Fort Monroe National Monument, just contact the National Monument and say, hey, you'd like an aerial image, and they'd send it to you for free. It's not a problem. Yep.
Gentlemen.
Where do I live there? Y'all want to come visit me? Or? Yeah, I live in an old casemate. No, I live directly across from the flag, the main flag, inside the fort. It's a lot of fun. You can come over sometime.
Here's one right here.
Hello. Back with the bricks with the fingerprints
Yes.
in there. Could it be possible that was a way of keeping the quota of who made the bricks? And could it possibly also be that the bricks are turned the other way around and the fingerprints might be on the other side?
Possible. Yeah, and again, I have, I'm not a masonry expert, and again, I don't know, really, why they were laid that way. Again, I have talked to folks that have assured me that, again, kind of what I said earlier, that Masons, they were very proud of their work. And again, there was always this big deal, and you see this even in the Fort Monroe records, always this big deal about, the number of usable bricks. When you're firing bricks, you're putting them in an oven, a lot of them are faulty and can't be used. So, a pristine brick that is smooth and the correct size was very valuable both to the Masons and to the Army, because the Army wouldn't pay for bricks that weren't perfect. So I don't know. I don't know at Fort Pulaski. I have no idea about that. Again, it's one of the things that requires additional research. I wish I had a better answer for you. Sandy.
And the question about the spelling of Mallory's
Yes.
name, as General Butler was sitting there and interviewing these three that just showed up at his desk, I can't imagine there wasn't a clerk there that was taking down the details afterwards, and that those records wouldn't be someplace.
Absolutely. So we do know I've looked at some of them, and there are some both at the Library of Congress and at the National Archives. And yes, Butler was keeping track of who was coming and going. But again, remember, a lot of times enslaved people may not have known how to spell their names. And again, it's important to remember, the Union Army officers may not have known how to spell either. So again, and spelling was very, it was phonetic. So again, you say, I can certainly hear how Mallory could be spelled with an E. It makes sense. In fact, it almost makes more sense. Mallory, So again, I think it was just an error. I will say, at the Library of Congress, Ben Butler's papers are at the Library of Congress in Washington, and if you're a geek, same word, nut, geek. If you're into that sort of stuff, Go to the Library of Congress, and anyone can do it. You get your reader's card. It takes about 10 minutes. Request the Ben Butler collection. You can look at ask for the 1861 collection when he's there. He was a lawyer by trade. He kept every single piece of paper. So, it's by week in the collection. May 1st to May 7th is like this much stuff. Well, I started going through some of this stuff, and Butler was in the office when people would come in, enslaved people would come in, and he had a clerk writing down the accounts because Butler was using this as a way to get intelligence. I say this with no disrespect. At that time, Butler was not interested. In May of '61, he was not interested in really emancipation. He was more interested in knowing what information enslaved people could tell him because they are the ones that had just come from the enemy lines. So Butler's having these interviews with enslaved recorded by a clerk, and there's some fascinating record of some of these conversations back and forth. And again, it's all phonetics. And again, the stereotypes of those days that would poke fun at certain ways people would talk, it's recorded in these letters. And it's fascinating. This is taking place in quarters 1 at Fort Monroe. And you can just read these letters and think about, you think about Ben Butler, and you think about this guy scribing, and you think about, this enslaved person that's there. And this is real stuff. It's happening. And again, you can read it. Butler's asking, where did you last see, the rebels? Well, they were 7 miles north, near Big Bethel and all. So that's an important point to remember. And again, this talk wasn't really about contraband decision per se, but when we think about it, Ben Butler in May of 24 wasn't thinking, I'm going to free slaves. He was thinking about what information can they give me, and how can I deprive my enemy of a resource, enslaved labor.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the issue with the spelling, I think is not a big deal. I do a lot of genealogy, and I've got one ancestor with 5 different spellings of her last name. And I have found it is the same individual, but there are 5 different variations of the spelling of her last name, and a lot of them are more significant than whether it's an E or an O. So it probably is the same person.
Every time I go and give this lecture, I've given this lecture maybe half dozen times now, there's always someone in the audience just like you. And it makes me feel so good because it makes me, again, I really believe, as a historian, as a researcher, I'm always very careful about saying the first, the last, the best, the greatest, because we want to be sure. And there's a lot of responsibility on our shoulders when we're doing this public history work to get it right, particularly when we're dealing with a subject like this, because this is people's family traditions and family histories, and it's just you really want to be respectful of that. But in my heart of hearts, I believe that it's the same Mallory, and again, I hope that additional research will prove that. But thank you for that comment. Yes, sir. I know you. How you doing?
How were the enslaved people treated by their new masters?
The Army, right? Great question. That's a wonder, and I like the way the gentleman phrased that question too, because that's exactly what happened. The enslaved came to Fort Monroe, they were declared contraband, and now who owns them? The United States Army. So in some sense, they've traded out a master for a new one. We know from archival records and from many, many sources that being declared contraband was not a walk in the park. In fact, it was almost a lot of the descriptions show that it's just like slavery. Again, they're being forced to labor. They were laboring before. Think about this, for example. We know that there were free blacks that sought refuge at Fort Monroe. And in many instances, simply because they were hungry or they needed shelter. So imagine if you're free and you go to Fort Monroe and then you're made to work right alongside people who were formerly enslaved. So again, that's another aspect of this to think about. Many people want to equate contraband with being free. No. We know that there was an effort to feed and to clothe and to eventually pay. But there's, as my good friend Dr. Bill Wiggins, who is in Hampton, who's been working on this story for longer than I've been alive, he reminds me whenever we talk about the contraband decision, he says, Robert, there were sexual assaults. There were rapes. There were people that were deprived of their money. There was corruption. So we need to keep that in the back of our mind. By the late by 64, 65, as you began to, after the Emancipation Proclamation, when a lot more missionary groups began to come to Fort Monroe from the north, there is a real push to ensure that conditions are somewhat improved. Again, these American Missionary Association, for example, are sending people into the South, into contraband camps, to try to ensure human rights and promote education and this type of thing. But it was that was a long answer, but it was tough. Yes, ma'am.
I've got a comment.
Go ahead.
There's an author named Dr. Amy Monroe Taylor, and she wrote In Battle Freedom. If you want to know how the enslaved people were treated, there's a lot of detail. You can find it.
What's the last name?
Her name is Taylor.
Taylor.
Dr. Amy Taylor, and In Battle Freedom.
Okay. Thank you.
Got time for two more, one here, and then we're going to wrap it up. And then after that, after we're officially finished, if you have questions or want to talk to Robert, he has no plans for the evening.
If we go on too long, we may have to retreat to the Yorktown pub or something.
So,
yes, ma'am.
I'm interested in the term contraband. It's always troubled me a bit,
Yes.
Because it's usually associated with goods.
Exactly.
Were there any other generals who came up with different names for the enslaved who were running for their freedom? I mean, Butler's term became the term.
It did.
But were there other terms at the same time that sort of faded into the distance?
I can tell you this, there were some much worse terms.
Really?
Again, this goes back to, I was kind of poking fun at Union soldiers and officers not necessarily being able to read or write. It's also important to remember that just because someone wore that blue uniform did not mean that they like black people. And I say that, it sounds, kind of strident for me to say that, but there were many very racist folks serving in the Union Army that did not believe in freedom or did not believe that this was a fight for emancipation. So that's part of the answer to your question. Contraband, yes, it refers to property. That's because, again, Butler was a lawyer, and that's how he felt he could justify not returning this property. It's actually, again, it sounds very strident to say, but it was a real stroke of genius for Butler to use this argument. Basically, the three men came to Fort Monroe. They were there. An owner for the three men, a Confederate, shows up at Fort Monroe and says, hey, under the fugitive slave law, you have to give me this property back. You have to give me my people back. And Butler says, well, why? Why do I have to give this property back? Well, the fugitive slave law says you do. The 1850 Fugitive Slave Act or fugitive slave law was in effect at this time. Butler takes the stance of, well, if you consider them property, I can do that too. And this property is being used against the Union Army in an act of war. So therefore, I'm going to seize it as I would a cannon or a gun or a horse, and seize it and not return it. Now again, yes, it's dehumanizing. Yes, it's counterintuitive to me standing up here and using the word enslaved. Absolutely, it's not a nice term. It's not an endearing term. It's a term that implies property. But again, it allowed Butler, who was this lawyer, to justify. And he also knew that his boss, his big boss, Lincoln, was also an attorney, a lawyer. and that Lincoln would understand this rationale. And this is not the time to go on about Ben Butler because I love the guy. He goes back, and again, I started out by saying he was a Democrat. He did not. He was not a. He was not an abolitionist by any means. He didn't really have much use for African Americans early in the war. He goes back to Massachusetts, becomes governor after the Civil War, and he's one of the first governors. In fact, he's the first governor to introduce civil rights legislation for African Americans. He led African Americans in the USCT, United States Colored Troops, during the Civil War. So this is a man, that's why I like Butler, because he's a guy that evolves and changes based on his surroundings and based on his knowledge and based on what he sees. He's a politician. Don't really like politicians too much. But he's a politician that evolved and learned and was willing to admit that he may have been wrong, and he actually did something about it through legislation. But yes, the term contraband, it's not a nice term. There were other descriptions, but again, contraband was pretty generally accepted because it could be justified and because, again, the legislative and legal minds of the folks that were engaged could understand it. It's not a nice term, but thank you for the question. Sorry for the long answer. Yes, sir.
Does optical character recognition and machine language and any of that kind of stuff help you with this thing? It looks like it would do with handwriting analysis and at least get you a long ways towards where you want to go with this stuff.
So what the gentleman is talking about, is there any way that we can utilize a computer program or something to help those that are transcribing?
Yeah, handwriting analysis.
Yeah, I've experimented with that stuff a little bit. The problem is, the handwriting is so non-uniform, and again, I think also from a time perspective, you would have to go back and check anyway. It's a thought, though.
I mean, if a certain person did a whole lot of that handwriting.
Right. Well, yeah, that could probably work. For example, if you had this, like you say, the same person. Yeah, but again, what we see at Fort Monroe is we don't really see much of that. We see the other kind of interesting thing is you can tell when the guy or when the person's arm starts getting tired, because that writing really, it's just like Ben Butler. When you look at his papers in the Library of Congress, the first page of his writing is quite legible. By page 5, it's like reading chicken scratch. But to answer your question, there's probably some software out there, and I would imagine as software and as technology improves, that may be something to utilize. But still, I think we'd want to have a person go back and double check.
The Emancipation Proclamation didn't apply to these people.
That's another good point. Yeah, so the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to many areas, and in fact, a lot. Yeah, and Williamsburg's another great example because but that's a cool thing to do. A lot of students and a lot of people don't realize is that there is fine print in the Emancipation Proclamation at the very bottom of it that excludes certain localities that were in control, held by the Union. So anyway.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up on that.